At 14:17 on the afternoon of May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith crouched behind a single 50 caliber machine gun in the radio compartment of a B-17 Flying Fortress, watching the French coastline slide beneath him like a map drawn in green and brown. 32 years old, a rich judge's son from Cairo, Michigan, his very first combat mission over occupied Europe. The 8th Air Force had sent 78 bombers to destroy the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire that afternoon. Saint-Nazaire was one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied France. The Germans had positioned over 200 anti-aircraft guns around the massive concrete U-boat shelters. Fighter squadrons from Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26 were stationed within minutes of the target. Allied bomber crews had a name for Saint-Nazaire. They called it Flak City. The submarine pens were built from reinforced concrete 12 feet thick. Allied bombs barely scratched them. But the orders kept coming because the U-boats operating from those pens were sinking Allied shipping at a catastrophic rate across the Atlantic. Smith's position was not in the ball turret, not on this mission. He had been assigned as a replacement gunner, filling in at various positions as needed. On this particular afternoon, he was manning the radio room gun, a single 50 caliber weapon mounted in a hatch on top of the fuselage, just behind the bomb bay. It was not the most glamorous position on the aircraft. It was not the most dangerous position. It was simply the position where Maynard Smith happened to be standing when everything went wrong. The B-17 carried 10 men, same as every flying fortress in the 8th Air Force. Pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer in the top turret, radio operator in the compartment behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open windows on either side of the fuselage, ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a revolving glass sphere, and Smith at the radio room gun, a position that gave him a view of the sky above and behind the bomber. Nobody on the crew wanted Maynard Smith there. Nobody in the entire 423rd Bombardment Squadron wanted him anywhere near a combat aircraft. He was the most unpopular man in the unit. Possibly the most unpopular man in the entire 306th Bombardment Group. And they had very good reasons for feeling that way. The story of Maynard "Snuffy" Smith begins not in the skies over France, but in the small town of Cairo, Michigan, where he was born on May 19th, 1911. His father was Circuit Judge Henry Luce Smith, one of the most respected men in Tuscola County. The family had money. The family had status. The family had expectations. Maynard met none of them. He was small, 5 feet 4 inches tall, barely 130 pounds soaking wet. He had a sharp tongue, a quick temper, and an absolute refusal to follow anyone else's rules. Where his father was dignified and commanding, Maynard was loud and contrary. Where his father built a career on discipline and order, Maynard seemed determined to demolish both concepts wherever he encountered them. He married young. It did not last. He married again. That did not last either. He fathered a son and showed little interest in raising him. He drifted from job to job across Michigan, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything permanent. He worked in factories. He sold insurance. He did whatever paid enough to keep him fed and housed until the next argument or the next scheme pulled him somewhere else. When the war began, Maynard Smith was 30 years old and facing a draft notice. He had 2 choices. Wait to be conscripted into the infantry, where small men with bad attitudes carried rifles through mud and died in large numbers. Or volunteer for the Army Air Forces, where the food was better, the quarters were cleaner, and the work was done at altitude rather than in trenches. Smith chose the Air Forces, not out of patriotism, not out of a burning desire to fly. He chose it because it seemed like the more comfortable option. Gunnery school revealed 2 contradictory truths about Maynard Smith. First, he was an excellent shot. His hand-eye coordination was superb. He could track moving targets with natural precision. He scored high marks on the firing range, and demonstrated genuine mechanical aptitude with the 50 caliber Browning machine gun. Second, he was absolutely insufferable as a human being. He argued with instructors. He questioned orders. He complained about everything. He was not lazy exactly. He simply believed that rules applied to other people. His size earned him the nickname Snuffy, after a popular comic strip character called Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. The cartoon Snuffy was a lazy, scheming hillbilly who avoided work and authority with equal determination. The resemblance to Maynard was close enough to make the nickname stick. He hated it. The other men used it anyway. Smith arrived at Thurley Airfield in Bedfordshire, England, in the spring of 1943, assigned to the 423rd Bombardment Squadron of the 306th Bomb Group. The 306th was known as the Reich Wreckers. They had been flying combat missions since October 1942 and had already suffered devastating losses. By the time Smith arrived, the group had lost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of men. The survivors were hardened veterans who had watched friends burn and die over targets across occupied Europe. Into this community of combat veterans walked Maynard Snuffy Smith, small, loud, opinionated, and utterly without combat experience. The veterans took one look at him and decided they wanted nothing to do with him. Smith made matters worse by being exactly who he had always been. He complained about the accommodations. He criticized the way things were run. He refused to perform menial tasks that he considered beneath him. He bragged about skills he had never tested in combat. The ground crews despised him. The other gunners avoided him. The officers viewed him as a disciplinary problem waiting to happen. Smith had been given multiple punishments for minor infractions before he ever set foot on an aircraft for a combat mission. He was confined to quarters. He was assigned extra duties. He was warned, reprimanded, and threatened. None of it changed his behavior. His fellow enlisted men at Thurley had developed a system for new arrivals. Replacement gunners bunked together, trained together, and flew their first missions together. They formed bonds quickly because their lives depended on trusting each other. Smith did not fit into this system. He argued with his bunkmates. He alienated potential crewmates. He was shuffled from one crew to another because nobody wanted to fly with him. By late April 1943, Smith had been at Thurley for several weeks without flying a single combat mission. This was unusual. Most replacement gunners were assigned to crews and sent over enemy territory within days. Smith's delays were caused entirely by his own behavior. Crew after crew rejected him. Pilots specifically requested that he not be assigned to their aircraft. The squadron operations officer finally ran out of patience. Smith would fly on the next available mission regardless of which crew wanted him. He would be assigned as a spare gunner. If he performed adequately, he would be given a permanent crew assignment. If he did not, he would be transferred to the infantry, fly and fight, or carry a rifle in the mud. May 1st, 1943. The mission briefing took place before dawn. The target was Saint-Nazaire. The men in the briefing room groaned. Saint-Nazaire meant heavy flak, aggressive fighters, and a significant chance of not coming home. Smith was assigned to the crew of Lieutenant Lewis P. Johnson. He would man the radio room gun. The crew regarded him with open suspicion. They had heard about him. Everyone at Thurley had heard about him. The small man with the big mouth who had never seen combat. They did not want him on their aircraft, but they had no choice. The B-17 took off from Thurley and joined the formation heading south across the English Channel. 78 bombers in tight defensive boxes, vapor trails, streaming behind them like white ribbons against the blue sky. Below, the channel sparkled in the afternoon sun. Ahead, the coast of France waited with its guns and its fighters. Smith sat in the radio compartment. The radio operator handled the communications equipment. Smith's job was simply to fire the gun mounted in the overhead hatch if enemy fighters appeared above and behind the aircraft. Point the gun at the enemy. Pull the trigger. Try not to shoot off your own tail. The formation crossed the French coast at 23,000 feet. Flak began immediately. Black bursts appeared in the sky like dark flowers, blooming and dying in rapid succession. The bomber shook with each nearby detonation. Shrapnel pinged against the aluminum skin. Smith had never heard the sound before. It sounded like hail hitting a tin roof. Hail made of razor-sharp steel fragments, traveling at thousands of feet per second. The bomb run required the formation to fly straight and level for several minutes. No evasive action, no turns. The bombers had to maintain exact heading, altitude, and speed, while the bombardiers aligned their Norden bomb sights on the target. During these minutes, the aircraft were completely predictable. Bombs away. The B-17 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from the bomb bay. The formation began its turn away from the target, heading north toward the English Channel. The mission was half over. The easy half. The German fighters appeared as the formation cleared the target area. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader 2, some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. They came in from multiple directions simultaneously. Frontal attacks to rattle the pilots, beam attacks from the sides to divide the gunners' attention, rear attacks aimed at the tail sections. Smith saw them, first from above. A pair of Focke-Wulfs diving through the formation from high altitude, their wings flickering with the flash of 20mm cannon fire. He swung his gun toward the nearest fighter and pressed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared. Spent brass casings bounced across the radio room floor. The fighter flashed past so quickly that Smith could not tell if he had hit it. Then, the world exploded. A 20mm cannon shell struck the fuselage just forward of Smith's position, then another. Then a burst that seemed to stitch a line of holes across the aircraft from one side to the other. The sound was beyond anything Smith had experienced. This was the sound of an aircraft being torn apart by weapons designed specifically to kill it. A fire broke out in the radio compartment. Aviation fuel from a ruptured line sprayed across hot metal and ignited. Flames climbed the walls and spread across the floor. The radio operator screamed and stumbled toward the rear of the aircraft. One of the waist gunners was hit. He collapsed against his gun mount, blood spreading across his flight suit. Smith looked forward through the narrow passage toward the bomb bay. Fire. The entire midsection of the aircraft was burning. Ammunition was cooking off in the heat, rounds exploding like firecrackers. Smoke filled every compartment. The intercom was dead. Smith had no communication with the cockpit. He had no way of knowing if the pilots were alive or dead, if the aircraft was under control or falling. What happened next is documented in official military records, eyewitness testimony, and the citation for the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. What happened next turned Maynard Snuffy Smith from the most despised man in the 423rd Bombardment Squadron into something no one expected. 3 of the crew members in the rear section of the aircraft made a decision. They saw the fire. They saw the ammunition exploding. They saw the German fighters still attacking, and they bailed out. They clipped their parachutes to their harnesses, moved to the open waist windows, and jumped. One after another, 3 men chose to take their chances with gravity and German captivity, rather than remain on a burning bomber. By all rational calculation, they made the correct decision. A B-17 on fire over enemy territory, with ammunition cooking off and fighters still attacking, was a death trap. The standard procedure, when fire could not be controlled, was to bail out. These men followed procedure. They survived the jump. They were captured by German forces and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. Maynard Smith stayed. He did not stay because he was brave in any conventional sense. He did not stay because he had calculated the odds and determined that remaining on the aircraft gave him a better chance of survival. He stayed because he looked at the fire and decided to fight it. Not for glory, not for medals. He fought the fire because it was there, and someone had to fight it, and no one else was going to do it. The fire extinguisher was mounted on the bulkhead near the radio operator's station. Smith grabbed it and aimed it at the base of the flames. The chemical spray knocked down part of the fire, but more fuel was leaking from damaged lines. The extinguisher ran dry. The fire was still burning. Smith looked around the compartment for anything else he could use. He found wool blankets stored for high-altitude cold weather protection. He wrapped the blankets around his hands and began beating at the flames. The wool singed and smoked, but did. Not catch fire immediately. He smothered one section of flames, turned to another, beat it down, turned to another. The heat was extraordinary. Aviation fuel burns at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The aluminum skin of the aircraft was beginning to soften and deform. Smoke filled the compartment so thickly that Smith could barely see. He breathed through his oxygen mask, but the heat was melting the rubber seals. His face burned. His hands burned through the wool blankets. Ammunition continued to cook off around him. Belts of .50 caliber rounds stored for the waist, guns were igniting in the heat. Bullets flew in random directions through the compartment. Any one of them could have killed him. He kept fighting the fire. Between bursts of firefighting, Smith moved to the waist gun positions. The fighters were still attacking. The gunners were gone. The weapons were unmanned. Smith ran from the fire to the gun, fired at an approaching fighter, ran back to the fire, beat it down, ran back to the gun, fired again. One man doing the work of four, alternating between firefighting and air defense. A Focke-Wulf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Smith swung the waist gun and pressed the trigger. Tracers arced toward the fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away. Smith ran back to the fire. Another section of wall was burning. He beat it with the charred remains of the blanket. The wool was almost gone, reduced to smoking fragments. He threw it aside and grabbed his leather flight jacket. He used the jacket to smother the flames, pressing it against the burning metal until the fire died. The ball turret gunner was still alive. He had been trapped in the glass sphere beneath the aircraft, unable to exit because the fire blocked the hatch above him. Smith cleared enough of the flames to open the hatch and pull the man up into the fuselage. The ball turret gunner was disoriented and terrified. Smith shouted at him to help fight the fire. The man stared at him with glassy eyes. Shock. He was in shock. Smith left him and went back to work alone. The waist gunner who had been hit was lying on the floor. Smith checked him. Still alive. Still breathing. Bleeding heavily from wounds in his side and legs. Smith pulled the man away from the fire and applied first aid from the aircraft's medical kit. He pressed bandages against the wounds and tied them in place with strips torn from parachute harnesses. The gunner groaned, but did not regain consciousness. Smith went back to the fire. It was smaller now. His efforts were working. The fuel leak had slowed as the damaged lines drained. The flames were retreating from the areas he had already smothered. But new spots kept igniting as hot metal contacted residual fuel. He chased each new flame with whatever was available. Clothing, rags, his bare hands when nothing else would do. The German fighters made another pass. Cannon shells punched through the fuselage. More holes appeared in the aluminum skin. The air rushing through the new holes actually helped by cooling the hot metal. Smith fired the waist gun at the departing fighters, then returned to his firefighting. Somewhere forward of the inferno, the pilots were still flying the aircraft. Smith could not see them. He could not hear them. He could not communicate with them in any way. But the aircraft maintained altitude and heading. Someone up there was still alive and still in control. The fight lasted approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes of continuous physical exertion at 23,000 feet in a burning aircraft under enemy attack. 90 minutes of running between fire and guns. 90 minutes of breathing, smoke, and dodging. Exploding ammunition, and beating flames with bare hands. 90 minutes that should have been impossible for any human being, let alone a 130-pound man on his first combat mission. When the fire was finally out, Smith surveyed the damage. The entire midsection of the B-17 was gutted. The radio compartment was destroyed. The waist gun positions were charred and deformed. The floor was covered in spent brass, melted aluminum, and blood. Holes in the fuselage let in streams of freezing air. The intercom was dead. The hydraulic system was damaged. Smith treated the wounded waist gunner again. The man's bleeding had slowed but not stopped. The bandages were soaking through. Smith applied more pressure, and more. Bandages. He covered the man with whatever fabric he could find to prevent hypothermia. The English Channel appeared ahead. The white cliffs of Dover materialized through the haze. Smith had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. England. Safety. The landing was rough. The B-17's hydraulic system was so badly damaged that the landing gear barely extended. The pilot brought the aircraft in fast and hard. The wheels touched the runway, and the bomber bounced. Metal shrieked. The aircraft skidded sideways before coming to a stop at the edge of the runway. Fire crews and ambulances raced to the aircraft. They expected to find corpses. When they saw the extent of the damage to the midsection, they assumed everyone behind the bomb bay was dead. No one could have survived in that inferno. Maynard Smith climbed out of the waist window and dropped to the ground. He was burned. His face was blistered and red. His hands were raw. His flight suit was charred and torn. He smelled like smoke and fuel and blood. The ground crew stared at him. Medical personnel rushed forward. Behind Smith, the ball turret gunner climbed out, followed by stretcher bearers carrying the wounded waist gunner. 3 men alive because one of them had refused to abandon a burning aircraft. The rescue crews examined the interior of the bomber and could not believe what they saw. The evidence of Smith's one-man battle was everywhere. The spent fire extinguisher, the charred blankets, the torn parachute harnesses used as bandages, the waist guns still loaded and positioned as if someone had been running between them and the fire. Military personnel began documenting the scene. Intelligence officers interviewed the surviving crew members. The pilot and co-pilot confirmed that they had been unable to communicate with anyone behind the bomb bay during the attack. They had not known if anyone was still alive. They had continued flying toward England because there was nothing else they could do. The pilot reported that the aircraft's controls had become increasingly sluggish as fire damaged the cables and hydraulic lines in the midsection. The fact that someone had extinguished the fire before it burned through the remaining control cables was the reason the aircraft remained flyable. Official reports began to circulate through the chain of command. The reports climbed through the military bureaucracy with unusual speed because the story they contained was unprecedented. A man on his first combat mission had single-handedly saved a B-17 from destruction by fire while simultaneously defending the aircraft against enemy fighters, treating wounded crew members, and rescuing a trapped ball turret gunner. The recommendation came quickly. Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States military could award. Maynard, Snuffy. Smith's actions on May 1st, 1943, met every criterion. The news spread through Thurley Airfield like wildfire. Snuffy Smith, Medal of Honor, the most unpopular man in the squadron. The loud-mouthed troublemaker who argued with everyone and followed no rules. He was going to receive the nation's highest military honor. The reaction was complex. Some men were genuinely impressed. They had seen the aircraft. They had heard the accounts. Whatever Smith's failings as a human being, his actions on that burning bomber were indisputably heroic. He had stayed when others jumped. He had fought when fighting seemed futile. Other men were resentful. Veterans who had flown 10, 15, 20 missions over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Men who had displayed consistent courage over months of combat. These men had received air medals and distinguished flying crosses, important decorations, but nothing approaching the Medal of Honor. And now, a first mission replacement gunner was going to receive the highest award. The resentment was not entirely irrational. The Medal of Honor carries unique weight in American military culture. It represents the absolute pinnacle of military achievement. The resentment was not entirely irrational. The Medal of Honor carries unique weight in American military culture. It represents the absolute pinnacle of military achievement. Awarding it to a man whose pre-combat record was defined by insubordination seemed to some like a mockery of the decoration itself. But the criteria for the Medal of Honor are based on specific actions taken in specific circumstances, not on character or popularity. Smith's actions on May 1st, 1943, were beyond dispute. Multiple witnesses confirmed what he had done. Physical evidence corroborated their accounts. The award ceremony took place on July 15th, 1943, at Thurley Airfield. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson made a special trip to England to present the medal personally. It was the first Medal of Honor awarded to an enlisted man in the Army Air Forces During World War II, Secretary Stimson pinned the Medal of Honor around Smith's neck, while photographers captured the moment. Smith stood at attention in his dress uniform, 5 feet 4 inches of contradiction. The troublemaker who became a hero. The man nobody wanted who did what nobody else could. The ceremony was covered by newspapers across the United States. Maynard Smith became famous overnight. His photograph appeared in Life magazine, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. The Army Air Force's public relations apparatus seized upon him as a symbol of American courage. The propaganda value was immense. But fame did not change Maynard Smith. If anything, it made him worse. The weeks and months following the ceremony revealed a truth that the Army Air Forces had not anticipated. Giving the nation's highest military decoration to a difficult, contrary, insubordinate man did not make him less difficult or less insubordinate. It simply gave him a new weapon to use against authority. The Medal of Honor made him untouchable, and he knew it. Smith was pulled from combat duty after his first mission. The Army Air Forces did not want to risk losing their first enlisted Medal of Honor recipient over enemy territory. He was reassigned to ground duties at Thurley. Smith chafed under the assignment. The nature of his resistance was motivated by a burning desire to do things his own way, on his own schedule, according to his own rules. The same qualities that had made him intolerable before the medal continued to make him intolerable after it. He refused to perform KP duty. He argued that a Medal of Honor recipient should not be required to peel potatoes. The argument had a certain logic, but it infuriated every other enlisted man on the base who was expected to take his KP shifts. He flouted dress code regulations. He missed formations. He talked back to non-commissioned officers. When confronted, he pointed to the pale blue ribbon around his neck. What were they going to do? Court-martial a Medal of Honor recipient for refusing to peel potatoes? The squadron commanders found themselves in an impossible position. Disciplining a Medal of Honor recipient would create a public relations disaster, but allowing him to behave without consequences undermined discipline for every other man on the base. Smith was given assignments that kept him away from the other enlisted men. He was sent on war bond tours across England, speaking to troops and civilians about his experience over Saint-Nazaire. He was photographed shaking hands with generals and politicians. The Army Air Forces used him as a symbol while trying to keep him from causing problems. The tours revealed another aspect of Smith's personality. He was genuinely charming when he wanted to be. He could work a room with natural charisma. He told his story with vivid detail and genuine emotion. Audiences loved him. He was compelling in front of crowds in a way that he never was in the barracks. But between appearances, the old Snuffy returned. He drank heavily. He gambled. He got into arguments at pubs and officers' clubs. His behavior became so notorious that the 306th Bomb Group's unofficial history would later describe him as the biggest headache the squadron ever had. Eventually, the Army Air Forces had enough. Smith was reduced in rank, not once, multiple times. The man who had been awarded the Medal of Honor as a staff sergeant was busted down to private. The reductions were technically for specific infractions: absence without leave, failure to obey orders, conduct unbecoming. Smith was demoted and demoted again over the course of his remaining time in the Army Air Forces. His service record reads like a roller coaster: private, private first class, corporal, back to private. The pattern repeated because the pattern of his behavior repeated. He would shape up long enough to earn a promotion, then revert to his natural state and lose it. Meanwhile, other men were dying over Germany. The 8th Air Force's losses in 1943 were catastrophic. The missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost over 100 bombers and more than 1,000 men. Crews arrived at Thurley and were dead within weeks. The 306th Bomb Group's roster turned over so many times that by the end of the war, few men remained who remembered Smith's famous mission. The war ground on. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. Allied armies poured into France. Long-range fighter escorts finally began accompanying the bombers deep into Germany. The tide turned. Germany began to collapse. Smith remained in England through most of the remaining war. He was transferred between units and assignments as commanders tried to find a place where he could function without causing disruption. No one found such a place. He flew additional combat missions later in the war. The exact number is disputed. Some sources credit him with 5 missions total. None produced anything approaching the drama of May 1st, 1943. Smith performed adequately on these missions. Not heroically, not poorly, adequately. The war ended in May 1945. Maynard Smith was discharged with a record that would confound military historians for decades. Medal of Honor recipient, multiple demotions. Disciplinary actions too numerous to catalog. He was simultaneously the best and worst soldier in the 306th Bomb Group, depending on which day you examined. Smith returned to the United States and discovered that fame does not pay the rent. The Medal of Honor came with a small monthly stipend, but it was not enough to live on. He needed work. He needed purpose. He settled in Alexandria, Virginia, and took a job with the Internal Revenue Service. The judge's son from Cairo, Michigan, the Medal of Honor recipient who had saved a burning bomber over Saint-Nazaire, became a tax clerk. He sat at a desk and processed tax returns. His co-workers at the IRS did not know about his medal. Smith did not tell them. He did not hang it on the wall of his cubicle. He did not mention it at office parties. The man who had been so conspicuous in the Army Air Forces became invisible in civilian life. Just another government employee doing his job and going home. Years passed. Smith married again. He had more children. He lived in a modest house and commuted to his modest job. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer. The memories of May 1st, 1943, remained vivid but unspoken. The anonymity was not entirely accidental. Smith had complicated feelings about his medal and his military service. He had been celebrated for 90 minutes of heroism and punished for everything else. The Army had simultaneously honored him and humiliated him. The contradiction defined his military experience, and he had no interest in reliving it publicly. But anonymity has limits when you hold the Medal of Honor. Periodically, someone would discover Smith's secret. A coworker would stumble across a reference in a book. A neighbor would hear a rumor. Each time, Smith would deflect attention and change the subject. The 306th Bomb Group held reunions after the war. Smith attended some, but not all. His reception was mixed. Some veterans greeted him warmly. Others maintained the old resentments. The passage of years softened some attitudes, but hardened others. Smith remained a polarizing figure among the men who had served with him. His personal life continued its turbulent pattern. Marriages failed. Relationships soured. He moved from place to place, never quite finding the stability that had eluded him since childhood. At the IRS, Smith eventually gained a degree of recognition. He was a competent employee when he chose to be. He understood numbers and systems. He was promoted several times and settled into a career that, while unglamorous, provided steady income and health benefits. Smith's health began to decline in the 1970s. The burns he sustained fighting the fire had left scar tissue that became increasingly painful with age. The smoke inhalation had damaged his lungs. The physical and psychological stress of combat had left marks on his body that decades of civilian life could not erase. He retired from the IRS and moved to Florida. The warm climate was easier on his damaged lungs and scarred skin. He lived quietly. The Medal of Honor remained in its case. In the early 1980s, a resurgence of interest in World War II brought new attention to Medal of Honor recipients. Historians and journalists began tracking down living recipients for interviews. The nation was beginning to understand that these men were aging and dying. Their stories would be lost if no one recorded them. Someone found Maynard Smith in Florida. An interview was arranged. For the first time in decades, Smith spoke publicly about May 1st, 1943. He described the fire, the fighters, the ammunition cooking off. He described running between the guns and the flames. He described pulling the ball turret gunner to safety. But he also described the aftermath, the resentment of his fellow airmen, the disciplinary actions, the demotions, the feeling of being simultaneously celebrated and despised. He spoke about the loneliness of being a hero that nobody liked. His honesty was disarming. He did not pretend to be something he was not. He acknowledged his own difficult behavior. He admitted that he had been a terrible soldier in every respect, except the one that mattered most. He had been brave when bravery was needed, and he had been impossible the rest of the time. The interviews revealed a man at peace with his contradictions. Smith understood that his story did not fit the neat narrative that military history preferred. Heroes were supposed to be humble, dedicated, disciplined men. Smith was none of those things. He was a loud, difficult, insubordinate man who happened to be extraordinarily brave when a burning bomber demanded extraordinary bravery. The two truths coexisted without canceling each other out. Smith himself never claimed to be a hero in the traditional sense. He described his actions as practical rather than heroic. The fire had to be fought because the alternative was death. The guns had to be fired because the alternative was being shot down. The wounded man had to be treated because the alternative was watching him die. Smith framed his decisions as obvious rather than courageous. Anyone would have done the same, he insisted. The fact that 3 other crew members had bailed out rather than face the same situation did not alter his conviction. This modesty about his combat actions contrasted sharply with his arrogance about everything else. The same man who insisted his Medal of Honor actions were simply common sense would argue for hours that he should not have to peel potatoes. Smith was genuinely humble about his bravery and genuinely insufferable about his privileges. Both qualities coexisted in the same 1.30-pound frame. In 1984, Smith was invited to the White House as part of a gathering of Medal of Honor recipients. President Ronald Reagan hosted the event. Smith attended in civilian clothes, the medal around his neck. He was 73 years old, still small, still sharp-tongued. But the years had softened him. The anger and arrogance of his youth had mellowed into wry acceptance. He was who he was. Photographs from the event show Smith standing among some of the most decorated warriors in American history. Men who had stormed beaches and captured hills and destroyed enemy positions under impossible fire. Smith stood among them as an equal, because the pale blue ribbon around his neck made him one. The question of Smith's character continued to fascinate military historians. Books about the Medal of Honor frequently devoted sections to him. He became a case study in military ethics classes. Could a bad soldier be a good hero? The answer, clearly, was yes. The more interesting question was what that answer meant. Some historians argued that Smith's very rebelliousness was what saved the B-17. A man who followed rules without question might have bailed out when the fire broke out, following standard procedure. Smith's instinct to reject authority, to refuse to accept the obvious conclusion, was what kept him on the burning bomber. He looked at a situation that every rational analysis said was hopeless and decided to fight it anyway. That was not discipline. That was defiance. And defiance, on May 1st, 1943, was exactly what was needed. Others dismissed this interpretation. Smith stayed because he was too stubborn to leave, not because of some noble contrarian instinct. His subsequent behavior proved that his rebelliousness was a character flaw that happened to produce a heroic outcome in one specific circumstance. The heroism was real. The man was flawed. Both statements could be true simultaneously. The ball turret gunner, whom Smith had rescued, survived the war and returned home. He credited Smith with saving his life. The wounded waist gunner also survived, recovering from his injuries in an English hospital. Both men testified to Smith's actions during the official Medal of Honor investigation. Both maintained throughout their lives that Smith's decision to stay and fight had been the difference between their survival and their death. The 3 crew members who bailed out were captured by German forces and spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. They survived and returned home after VE Day. Their decision to bail out was never officially criticized. They followed procedure. No one faulted them for choosing to jump from a burning aircraft. But their choice stood in contrast to Smith's, and that contrast defined the narrative of May 1st, 1943. The pilot and co-pilot who kept the crippled B-17 flying while Smith fought the fire were both awarded Distinguished Flying Crosses. Their skill in maintaining control of a severely damaged aircraft was essential to the survival of everyone aboard. The pilot's citation noted that he had continued to fly despite having no knowledge of conditions behind the bomb bay. Maynard Harrison Snuffy Smith died on May 11th, 1984, in Florida. He was 73 years old. He had outlived most of his wartime contemporaries. He had outlived the resentments and the controversies and the arguments about whether he deserved the Medal of Honor. His obituary ran in newspapers across the country. Medal of Honor recipient. First enlisted man in the Army Air Forces to receive the decoration. Saved a burning B-17 over Saint-Nazaire. The facts spoke for themselves. The complexities of his character were mentioned briefly or not at all. Death simplified his story in a way that life never had. He was buried with full military honors. The Medal of Honor was displayed on his casket. A firing squad discharged 3 volleys. Taps echoed across the cemetery. The flag was folded and presented to his family. The B-17 that Smith had saved was repaired after the mission. Ground crews at Thurley patched the holes, replaced the burned wiring and control cables, and returned the bomber to service. It flew additional missions over occupied Europe. Smith's firefighting had not merely saved 3 lives. It had saved a weapon that would contribute to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The 306th Bomb Group flew its final combat mission on April 19, 1945. Over the course of the war, the group had lost 177 aircraft and suffered over 2,000 casualties. The group's history was written in blood and aluminum and high explosives. Maynard Smith's name occupied a unique place in that history. Fewer than 3,500 Medals of Honor have been awarded in the entire history of the United States military, spanning from the Civil War to the present day. Each one represents a moment when an individual transcended the normal limits of courage. Maynard Smith's moment came on a burning B-17 over France. 90 minutes that defined a lifetime. A lifetime that refused to be defined by those 90 minutes alone. Perhaps that is the most important truth about Maynard Snuffy Smith. He was not a hero despite his flaws. He was a hero because of the same qualities that made him flawed. His stubbornness, his contrariness, his absolute refusal to accept anyone else's assessment of what was possible or impossible. These were the traits that kept him on a burning bomber when every rational calculation said to jump. These were also the traits that made him impossible to live with, work with, or command. The military prefers its heroes clean. Humble men from humble backgrounds who serve with quiet distinction, perform extraordinary acts when called upon, and return to humble lives when the fighting is done. Maynard Smith did not fit that mold. He was not humble. He was not quiet. He did not serve with distinction outside of one blazing afternoon over Saint-Nazaire. He was a mess. A brilliant, infuriating, courageous, impossible mess. And on May 1st, 1943, that mess saved a B-17 and the lives of every man still aboard it. He ran through fire. He breathed smoke. He burned his hands, beating out flames. He fired machine guns at German fighters between bouts of firefighting. He pulled a trapped man to safety. He treated a wounded man's injuries. He did all of this on his first combat mission, at 23,000 feet, in a burning aircraft, while ammunition exploded around him. Then he climbed out of the wreckage, stood on English soil, and went back to being the most difficult man anyone had ever met. The Medal of Honor citation reads in part, "The aircraft was subjected to intense anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. Staff Sergeant Smith, although not required to do so, manned his station and fought the blaze. He threw flaming debris overboard. He manned first one gun and then another, beating off enemy attacks. He administered first aid to wounded crew members and put out fires. His heroic actions resulted in the saving of the aircraft and the lives of several crew members." The words are precise and understated. They do not capture the heat or the smoke or the terror. They do not describe the sound of ammunition cooking off or the sight of a fuselage melting around you. They do not convey what it feels like to be a 130-pound man from Cairo, Michigan, standing alone in a furnace at 23,000 feet, fighting death with charred blankets and bare hands. But the words are there, officially, permanently, and, grading, permanently. Whatever else Maynard Snuffy Smith was or was not, whatever else he did or failed to do, on one afternoon in May 1943, he was the bravest man in the sky.